Have you ever wondered why the serpent in the Garden of Eden could speak? Why this creature possessed knowledge that seemed almost divine? What if I told you that hidden within the original Hebrew text of Genesis lies a secret so profound, so earth-shattering, that it completely transforms everything you thought you knew about the fall of humanity? Today we're about to uncover a mystery that has been buried beneath centuries of translation and interpretation. A truth so startling that when you discover it, you'll never read the story of Adam and Eve the same way again. This isn't just another Bible study, this is an archaeological dig into the very language of creation itself. You see, most of us have grown up with a simple understanding. The serpent tempted Eve, she ate the forbidden fruit, and humanity fell into sin. But what if that serpent wasn't just any ordinary creature? What if the Hebrew language reveals something far more complex, far more terrifying about what really happened in Eden? The word used in the original Hebrew text carries implications that will shake you to your core. It suggests something that most translations have either missed or deliberately obscured. Something that changes not just the story of the fall, but our entire understanding of the spiritual realm and the forces that have been at work since the very beginning. If you're ready to dive deeper than surface-level Sunday school stories, if you're prepared to handle truths that might challenge everything you've been taught, then stay with me. Comment 777 if you're ready to unlock the Hebrew secrets that have been hidden in plain sight for millennia. And thank you to everyone who supports this channel. Your engagement helps us bring these buried truths to light. Let's begin this journey into the shadows of Genesis, where ancient Hebrew reveals secrets that will forever change your understanding of the serpent's true identity. The Hebrew mystery that transforms Genesis begins with a single word. In our English Bibles, we simply read about a serpent, but the Hebrew word used here is nachash, and this word carries layers of meaning that most translations completely ignore. It's as if we've been reading a story through frosted glass, seeing only shadows of the truth. In ancient Hebrew, nachash doesn't just mean snake or serpent. This word has a richness that suggests something far more complex. The root of nachash connects to concepts of divination, enchantment, and supernatural knowledge. It's the same root used for practices involving otherworldly wisdom and hidden understanding. Can you see where this is heading? But here's where it gets fascinating. The Hebrew language reveals that this nachash possessed characteristics that no ordinary serpent could have. The text describes a being that walked upright, that possessed intelligence beyond any animal, and that had access to knowledge about God's commands that it shouldn't have possessed. This wasn't just a talking snake, this was something else entirely. Ancient Hebrew scholars understood something that has been lost in our modern translations. They recognized that the nachash represented a class of being that existed between the earthly and the divine, a creature that had fallen from a higher state but retained certain supernatural abilities. The implications of this understanding are staggering. Think about it for a moment. If the nachash was merely an animal, how could it comprehend the complex theological implications of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? How could it engage in sophisticated reasoning with Eve about the consequences of disobedience? How could it promise that she would become like God, knowing good and evil? The Hebrew text suggests that this being had intimate knowledge of God's nature and purposes. It understood the spiritual mechanics of what would happen when humanity crossed that forbidden line. This wasn't the cunning of an animal. This was the calculated manipulation of a being that had once dwelt in the presence of the Almighty. But the mystery deepens when we examine the curse that God pronounced upon the Nachash. The Hebrew reveals something that most English translations miss entirely. God didn't just condemn a snake to crawl on its belly. The curse suggests a dramatic transformation from a higher form of existence to a lower one. It speaks of a being that once had a different nature entirely. The ancient Hebrew indicates that before the curse, the Nachash moved differently, existed differently, operated on a plane that was closer to the divine realm. The punishment wasn't just physical, it was ontological. The very nature of this being was altered as consequence for its deception. Now here's where this Hebrew secret becomes truly explosive. If the Nachash wasn't originally a serpent as we understand it, then what was it? The Hebrew language provides clues that point to something far more unsettling. Something that challenges our comfortable categories of good and evil, of creature and creator. The word nachash appears throughout the Hebrew Bible in contexts that have nothing to do with snakes. It's used to describe practices of divination and supernatural knowledge. It's connected to beings that operate in the spiritual realm with power and intelligence. It's associated with entities that can appear as something other than what they truly are. Are you beginning to see the pattern? The Hebrew is telling us that what entered the garden wasn't just an animal that could speak. It was a being of supernatural intelligence and power, something that had fallen from a higher state but retained enough of its former nature to deceive the crown of God's creation. This understanding transforms everything about the fall narrative. It means that humanity wasn't just tricked by a clever animal. We were deceived by a being that understood exactly what it was doing, that calculated the consequences, and that deliberately set in motion the corruption of God's perfect creation. The Hebrew reveals that this Nachash had access to theological knowledge that should have been impossible for any created being outside of the divine counsel. It knew about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It understood what eating from it would accomplish. It recognized that humanity would indeed become like God in knowing good and evil, just as it promised. But here's the most chilling part of this Hebrew revelation. The Nachash didn't lie to Eve. Everything it told her was technically true. She didn't die immediately upon eating the fruit. Her eyes were opened. She did become like God in knowing good and evil. The deception wasn't in false information. It was in incomplete information. This level of sophisticated manipulation reveals a being of extraordinary intelligence and cunning, something that could take truth and weaponize it for destruction. Something that understood the human heart well enough to know exactly which truths would lead to disobedience. The Hebrew word nachash also connects to the concept of shining or brightness. Ancient texts describe beings of light that possessed wisdom and beauty beyond human comprehension. Could it be that the Nachash was once a being of radiant glory that had been corrupted and fallen from its original state? This connection to light and brightness in the Hebrew creates a disturbing parallel. If the Nachash was once a being of light, then its fall represents not just disobedience, but a complete inversion of its nature. Light becoming darkness, wisdom becoming deception, glory becoming shame. The implications cascade through the entire Genesis narrative. If humanity was deceived by a fallen being of supernatural intelligence and power, then the fall takes on cosmic proportions. This wasn't just a moral failure. It was a supernatural assault on God's creation by a being that had intimate knowledge of both the divine nature and human psychology. The Hebrew secret reveals that from the very beginning, humanity has been caught in a conflict that extends far beyond the physical realm. We've been pawns in a war between beings of supernatural power, beings that operate according to rules and realities that we barely comprehend. But this is only the beginning of what the Hebrew language reveals about the true nature of the Nachash. The deeper we dig into the original text, the more disturbing the truth becomes. There are layers upon layers of meaning that have been buried beneath centuries of simplified translation and interpretation. What we've uncovered so far is just the surface of a mystery that reaches into the very foundations of reality itself. The Hebrew doesn't just tell us what the Nachash was, it reveals something far more unsettling about what it represents and why its presence in the garden was so catastrophically effective. The ancient scribes who preserved these Hebrew texts understood something that we've forgotten in our modern world. They recognize that the spiritual realm operates according to principles and hierarchies that intersect with physical reality in ways that can fundamentally alter the course of human history. Stay with me, because what comes next will shatter every comfortable assumption you've ever held about the nature of evil, the fall of humanity, and the forces that continue to operate in our world today. The Hebrew secret we're uncovering doesn't just change how we read Genesis. It changes how we understand the entire cosmic conflict between light and darkness that continues to rage around us. The Hebrew text reveals something even more disturbing when we examine the actual conversation between the Nachash and Eve. Most English translations make it sound like a simple dialogue, but the original Hebrew suggests something far more sinister was taking place. The language patterns indicate a form of spiritual manipulation that goes beyond mere words. In Hebrew, the Nachash doesn't just speak to Eve. The verb form suggests it was operating on multiple levels simultaneously. It was engaging her mind with logical arguments, but the Hebrew structure implies it was also working on her emotions, her desires, and even her spiritual perception. This wasn't conversation. This was a coordinated assault on every aspect of human nature. The Hebrew word for the Nachash's speech carries connotations of whispering, of intimate suggestion, of planting ideas that feel like they originated from within rather than from an external source. Can you imagine the sophistication required for this kind of psychological warfare? This being understood human nature so completely that it could make its suggestions feel like Eve's own thoughts. But here's where the Hebrew reveals something that will make your skin crawl. The Nachash didn't approach Adam first. even though Adam was the one who received the direct command from God about the forbidden tree. It specifically targeted Eve. The Hebrew suggests this choice was calculated and deliberate, based on a deep understanding of human relationships and spiritual authority. The ancient Hebrew scholars recognized that the Nachash possessed knowledge about the order of creation that allowed it to identify the most effective point of attack. It understood something about the relationship between Adam and Eve, about their respective roles and vulnerabilities, that enabled it to craft a strategy of maximum destruction. Think about the implications. This being had been observing. It had been studying. It had been learning the patterns of human behavior and the dynamics of human relationships. The Hebrew reveals a level of premeditation that transforms this from a spontaneous temptation into a carefully orchestrated campaign of deception. The word Nachash also appears in Hebrew texts describing beings that could take on different forms, that could appear as something other than their true nature. Ancient Hebrew literature speaks of entities that could manifest in whatever shape would be most effective for their purposes. The serpent form wasn't the Nachash's true appearance, it was a disguise. This shape-shifting ability revealed in the Hebrew creates a terrifying possibility. If the Nachash could appear as a serpent to deceive Eve, what other forms might it have taken? How many times might it have observed Adam and Eve without them realizing they were being watched? How thoroughly had it studied them before making its move? The Hebrew language structure also reveals something about the timing of the Nachash's approach. The verb tenses suggest this encounter didn't happen immediately after creation. There was a period of observation, of waiting, of preparation. The Nachash had been present in the garden for some time, learning, planning, choosing the perfect moment to strike. But the most chilling revelation comes when we examine what the Hebrew says about the Nachash's knowledge of God's character. When it told Eve that she would not surely die, it wasn't just contradicting God's command. The Hebrew structure suggests it was demonstrating intimate knowledge of God's mercy and justice that should have been impossible for any created being to possess. The Nachash knew that God wouldn't immediately execute judgment. It understood the divine nature well enough to predict that there would be consequences, but not instant death. This level of theological sophistication reveals a being that had once existed in close proximity to the divine presence, that had observed God's character and learned to predict divine behavior. The Hebrew word for the Nachash's promise to Eve about becoming like God carries layers of meaning that are absolutely crucial to understanding what really happened. It wasn't promising that she would become a god. The Hebrew suggests it was offering her access to a form of knowledge and perception that belonged to a different order of being entirely. This promise reveals that the Nachash understood the hierarchical nature of creation in ways that Adam and Eve did not. It knew about different levels of existence, different categories of being, different types of knowledge and awareness. It was offering to move Eve up in this hierarchy, but through illegitimate means. The Hebrew also reveals something disturbing about the fruit itself. The text suggests that eating from the tree wouldn't just give knowledge of good and evil. The Hebrew indicates it would alter the very nature of human perception and consciousness. It would change not just what they knew, but how they knew it. The Nachash understood that this transformation would be irreversible. The Hebrew verb forms indicate permanence, a crossing of a threshold that could never be uncrossed. This being knew exactly what it was condemning humanity to, and it did it anyway. The malice revealed in the Hebrew is breathtaking. But here's where the Hebrew secret becomes truly explosive. The Nachash's knowledge of the tree's effects suggests it had either witnessed or experienced something similar before. The Hebrew language patterns indicate this being spoke from experience, not just theoretical knowledge. Had there been other gardens, other tests, other falls? The ancient Hebrew texts hint at a cosmic pattern, a repeated cycle of temptation and fall that extends far beyond the Garden of Eden. The Nachash's expertise in deception suggests it had practiced these techniques before, had refined its methods through previous encounters with other created beings. The Hebrew word for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil itself carries implications that most translations completely miss. It's not just about moral knowledge. The Hebrew suggests this tree gave access to experiential knowledge of the full spectrum of reality, including aspects of existence that were meant to remain hidden from created beings. The Nachash offered Eve godlike knowledge, but the Hebrew reveals it was actually offering her access to realms of experience that would corrupt and destroy her original nature. It was promising enlightenment while delivering spiritual death. The sophistication of this deception reveals a being of terrifying intelligence and malevolence. What we're uncovering in the Hebrew text isn't just the story of humanity's fall. It's the revelation of a cosmic predator, a being of supernatural intelligence and power that has been systematically working to corrupt and destroy God's creation from the very beginning. And the most terrifying part, the Hebrew suggests this being is still active, still using these same techniques, still hunting for those who might be vulnerable to its ancient strategies of deception. The implications of this Hebrew revelation extend far beyond ancient history. They reach into our present reality, into the spiritual warfare that continues to rage around us every day. Understanding the true nature of the Nachash changes everything about how we perceive the forces of darkness that continue to operate in our world. The Hebrew reveals something even more disturbing about what happened after the deception was complete. When Adam and Eve realized they were naked and felt shame for the first time, the text suggests the Nachash was still present, still watching, still observing the results of its handiwork. The Hebrew verb forms indicate ongoing presence rather than departure. Think about the psychological torment of that moment. The very being that had orchestrated their destruction was witnessing their humiliation and terror. The Hebrew suggests a kind of spiritual sadism, a deliberate choice to remain and savor the devastation it had caused. This wasn't just deception, it was cruelty of the highest order. But here's where the Hebrew mystery deepens into something truly shocking. When God came walking in the garden in the cool of the day, calling for Adam and Eve, the Hebrew text suggests something extraordinary about this encounter. The language patterns indicate that God knew exactly what had happened and exactly who was responsible. Yet the questioning wasn't for divine information gathering. The Hebrew reveals that God's questions to Adam and Eve were actually a form of spiritual forensics, a methodical uncovering of the Nachash's methodology for purposes that extend far beyond that moment in the garden. Every question was designed to expose not just what humanity had done, but how they had been manipulated into doing it. When God asked Adam, "Who told you that you were naked?" the Hebrew structure suggests this wasn't about shame over physical exposure. The word for naked in Hebrew carries implications of spiritual vulnerability, of being stripped of divine protection and covering. God was asking who had taught them to perceive their spiritual condition in this new and terrifying way. The Hebrew also reveals something crucial about Adam's response when he essentially blamed both Eve and God himself for what had happened. The language structure shows that Adam was still under the influence of the Nachash's deception, still thinking according to the patterns of reasoning that the Nachash had introduced. The corruption wasn't just in the act of disobedience, it was in the way of thinking that made disobedience seem reasonable. This reveals the true genius of the Nachash's strategy. It didn't just trick humanity into a single act of rebellion. The Hebrew shows it fundamentally altered human reasoning processes, implanting thought patterns that would continue to generate rebellion and dysfunction long after the initial deception. It had created a self-perpetuating system of spiritual corruption. The Hebrew word for the curse that God pronounced upon the Nachash contains layers of meaning that are absolutely crucial for understanding what was really happening in that moment. Most translations make it sound like God was simply punishing a snake, but the Hebrew reveals something far more cosmic in scope. The curse wasn't just about crawling on belly and eating dust. The Hebrew language indicates a fundamental alteration of the Nachash's nature and capabilities, a stripping away of powers and privileges that it had once possessed. The text suggests this being was being reduced from a higher order of existence to a lower one as direct consequence for its actions. But the most significant aspect of this curse is revealed in the Hebrew prophecy about the ongoing conflict between the Nachash's offspring and humanity's offspring. This wasn't just a prediction about snakes and people. The Hebrew language structure indicates an ongoing spiritual war between two different lineages, two different kinds to completely different principles. The Hebrew war of beings operating according for offspring in this context doesn't just mean biological descendants. It carries implications of spiritual inheritance, of beings that would carry forward the nature and characteristics of their progenitor. The Nachash would have spiritual descendants who would continue its work of deception and corruption throughout human history. This Hebrew revelation transforms our understanding of human history itself. It suggests that the conflict between good and evil isn't just about abstract moral principles. It's about two different kinds of beings, two different spiritual lineages, locked in an ongoing war that has been raging since the Garden of Eden. The ancient Hebrew scribes understood something that we've largely forgotten in our modern world. They recognized that certain individuals throughout history have been more than just morally corrupt humans. They've been carriers of the Nachash's spiritual DNA. Beings who operate according to the same principles of deception and manipulation that were first introduced in the garden. The Hebrew language also reveals something disturbing about the nature of the knowledge that humanity gained by eating from the forbidden tree. The word for knowledge in Hebrew doesn't just mean intellectual understanding. It carries connotations of intimate, experiential knowledge, the kind that comes from direct participation rather than observation. When Adam and Eve gained knowledge of good and evil, the Hebrew suggests they didn't just learn about these concepts. They became experientially acquainted with evil in a way that fundamentally altered their nature. They crossed a threshold from innocence into a form of awareness that included direct, personal knowledge of corruption and darkness. The Nachash had promised that this knowledge would make them like God, and in a twisted sense it did. But the Hebrew reveals that godlike knowledge without godlike nature is a form of spiritual torture. They gained awareness of realities they were never designed to handle, perspectives they couldn't process without being damaged by them. This Hebrew insight explains why the tree was forbidden in the first place. It wasn't arbitrary divine restriction. The Hebrew language suggests it was protective divine wisdom, an understanding that certain forms of knowledge are inherently corrupting to beings of limited spiritual capacity. God was trying to protect humanity from experiences that would destroy their original nature. The Nachash's promise of enlightenment was technically true but practically devastating. The Hebrew reveals that truth can be weaponized when it's divorced from wisdom and love. The Nachash gave humanity accurate information that led to spiritual destruction because it understood that knowledge without proper context and preparation is a form of poison. But here's where the Hebrew secret becomes truly mind-bending. The text suggests that the Nachash's ability to predict the consequences of eating from the tree indicates it had access to prophetic knowledge, the ability to see future outcomes with supernatural accuracy. This wasn't just intelligence. It was a form of divine knowledge that should have been impossible for any created being to possess independently. The implications are staggering. If the Nachash could see the future consequences of its deception, then every aspect of the fall was premeditated. It knew that humanity would gain the knowledge it promised. It knew that they would experience shame and fear. It knew that they would be expelled from the garden. It orchestrated all of this deliberately. The Hebrew language reveals that the Nachash didn't just want to corrupt humanity. It wanted to corrupt them in a way that would separate them from God permanently. It understood that certain forms of knowledge would make it impossible for humans to exist in the direct presence of divine holiness. It was deliberately engineering their exile from Eden. This level of calculated malevolence revealed in the Hebrew text is almost impossible to comprehend. The Nachash wasn't just rebelling against God's authority. It was systematically destroying God's most beloved creation in the most painful way possible. It was turning God's own gift of free will into a weapon against divine love. The ancient Hebrew also contains hints about the Nachash's motivation for this elaborate scheme of destruction. The language pattern suggests this being was driven not just by rebellion, but by a specific form of jealousy and rage directed at humanity's unique position in creation. The Nachash envied something about human nature that it could never possess. The Hebrew reveals that humans were created with a capacity for relationship with God that was different from any other created being. We were made in God's image in a way that gave us access to divine intimacy that even the highest spiritual beings couldn't experience. The Nachash's deception was motivated by a desire to destroy what it could never have. This Hebrew insight explains the peculiar sadism of the Nachash's approach. It didn't just want to corrupt humanity. It wanted to corrupt us in a way that would destroy the very thing it envied most about us. It wanted to sever our connection to God permanently, to reduce us to its own state of spiritual exile and separation. But the Hebrew text also contains something that the Nachash apparently didn't anticipate. Hidden within the curse pronounced upon it is a prophecy that speaks of its ultimate defeat. The Hebrew language suggests that the same capacity for divine relationship that the Nachash sought to destroy would eventually become the means of its own destruction. The promise of an offspring who would crush the Nachash's head isn't just about physical victory. The Hebrew indicates a spiritual triumph that would reverse the effects of the original deception and restore the possibility of divine intimacy that the Nachash had sought to destroy forever. The very thing it envied would become the instrument of its defeat. This Hebrew revelation transforms our understanding of the entire biblical narrative. Every story, every prophecy, every promise becomes part of an ongoing cosmic conflict between the Nachash's agenda of deception and separation and God's plan of redemption and restoration. The war that began in Eden continues to rage in every human heart. The Hebrew text reveals something that will fundamentally alter how you understand not just the fall, but the entire structure of reality itself. When we examine the aftermath of the Nachash's deception, the original language exposes a truth so profound that it explains every form of spiritual warfare and deception that has plagued humanity throughout history. You see, the Hebrew doesn't just describe what happened to Adam and Eve after they ate the forbidden fruit. It reveals what happened to human consciousness itself. The word used for their newfound awareness carries implications that go far beyond simple moral knowledge. The Hebrew suggests that eating from the tree didn't just teach them about good and evil. It fundamentally rewired their entire perceptual framework. Before the fall, the Hebrew indicates that human consciousness operated on a single level. Adam and Eve perceived reality directly, without the constant internal dialogue and moral calculation that characterizes fallen human thinking. They existed in a state of unified awareness where thought, emotion, and spiritual perception were perfectly integrated. But after the Nachash's deception succeeded, the Hebrew reveals that human consciousness became fractured. The text suggests that we developed what could only be described as a dual nature. Part of us retained the capacity for divine connection and truth, while another part became susceptible to the same patterns of deception and rebellion that characterized the Nachash itself. This Hebrew insight explains something that has puzzled theologians for centuries. Why do humans seem capable of both incredible nobility and shocking depravity? Why can the same person who shows extraordinary love and compassion also harbor thoughts and desires that are utterly destructive? The Hebrew reveals that we're literally carrying two different operating systems in our consciousness. The Nachash didn't just corrupt humanity. The Hebrew language suggests it implanted something of its own nature into human psychology. We became hybrid beings, retaining our divine image while also carrying what the Hebrew describes as the seed of the serpent. This isn't metaphorical. The language indicates an actual alteration of human nature at the deepest level. Think about the implications. Every human being born after the fall carries within themselves both the capacity for connection with God and susceptibility to the Nachash's influence. We're walking battlegrounds where these two natures constantly war against each other. The Hebrew reveals that this internal conflict isn't a design flaw, it's the result of spiritual contamination. But here's where the Hebrew secret becomes truly terrifying. The text suggests that the Nachash's influence didn't remain passive after the fall. The language patterns indicate that this being continued to work actively within human consciousness, whispering suggestions and planting thoughts in ways that feel like they originate from our own minds. The Hebrew word for temptation that appears throughout Scripture carries connotations of testing and proving, but also of seduction and gradual corruption. It's the same root connected to the Nachash's original deception of Eve. The text reveals that the techniques used in the garden have become the template for all subsequent spiritual attack. Ancient Hebrew scholars recognized that the Nachash had essentially created a blueprint for corrupting human consciousness. Every temptation, every deception, every form of spiritual manipulation that humans experience follows the same pattern established in Eden. The Nachash had created a replicable system of corruption. The Hebrew also reveals something disturbing about how this system spreads. When Adam and Eve had children, the text suggests that the spiritual contamination was passed down not just through genetic inheritance, but through the very process of human consciousness development. Each new generation learns to think according to patterns that were originally introduced by the Nachash. This explains why certain forms of deception seem to arise spontaneously in human societies throughout history. The Hebrew reveals that we're not just learning these patterns from each other. We're inheriting them from a source that transcends normal human experience. The Nachash's influence has become embedded in the very structure of fallen human consciousness. But the Hebrew text contains an even more shocking revelation. The language suggests that some individuals throughout history have served as more direct conduits for the Nachash's influence. These aren't just people who happen to be particularly evil. The Hebrew indicates they're individuals who have somehow become more fully aligned with the Nachash's nature and purposes. The ancient Hebrew contains references to what could only be described as the Nachash's spiritual offspring. These are beings who carry more of the serpent's nature than normal humans. Individuals who seem to operate according to supernatural levels of cunning and malevolence. They appear throughout biblical history as the primary agents of deception and corruption. The Hebrew reveals that these individuals can be identified by certain characteristics that mirror the original Nachash. They possess unusual charisma and persuasive ability. They demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human psychology and spiritual dynamics. They're able to present destructive ideas in ways that seem reasonable and attractive, And most tellingly, they seem to have access to knowledge and insights that should be beyond normal human capability. Think about the historical figures who have led humanity into the greatest disasters. The Hebrew suggests that many of these weren't just exceptionally evil humans. They were individuals who had become so aligned with the Nachash's nature that they served as conduits for its ongoing work of deception and destruction. The Hebrew language also reveals something crucial about how to recognize the Nachash's influence in our own time. The text provides specific patterns and characteristics that mark its presence. Understanding these markers becomes essential for spiritual survival in a world where this ancient deception continues to operate. One of the most significant Hebrew insights concerns the Nachash's relationship to truth. The original deception in Eden wasn't based on obvious lies. The Hebrew reveals that the Nachash specializes in partial truths, accurate information presented in misleading contexts, and promises that are technically correct but practically destructive. This pattern continues throughout human history. The Hebrew shows that the most effective deceptions aren't outright falsehoods. They're truths that have been twisted, incomplete information presented as complete, and accurate facts arranged to support false conclusions. The Nachash understood that humans are more likely to be deceived by sophisticated manipulation of truth than by obvious lies. The Hebrew also reveals something about the Nachash's use of spiritual language and concepts. In Eden, it engaged Eve in theological discussion, demonstrating knowledge of God's character and commands. The Hebrew suggests this being continues to use religious and spiritual frameworks as vehicles for deception, appearing as an angel of light to corrupt truth from within. This insight explains why some of the most destructive movements in human history have emerged from within religious contexts. The Hebrew reveals that the Nachash doesn't just attack faith from the outside. It infiltrates spiritual communities and uses their own language and concepts to introduce corruption and division. The ancient Hebrew texts also contain warnings about the Nachash's ability to appear in different forms and use various personalities as instruments of deception. The language suggests this being isn't limited to working through obviously evil individuals. It can influence and manipulate people who consider themselves good and righteous. This Hebrew revelation is particularly disturbing because it means that well-intentioned people can become unknowing agents of the Nachash's agenda. They might genuinely believe they're serving God or humanity while actually advancing patterns of thinking and behavior that align with the ancient serpent's purposes. The Hebrew word for deception that appears in connection with the Nachash carries connotations of leading astray, of causing someone to wander from the correct path. But it also suggests a gradual process rather than sudden corruption. The Nachash specializes in slow, subtle influence that changes direction almost imperceptibly over time. This explains why the Nachash's deceptions are so effective. The Hebrew reveals that this being understands human psychology well enough to introduce changes gradually, in ways that feel natural and reasonable at each step. By the time the full extent of the deception becomes apparent, the victim has already traveled far from their original position. The Hebrew text also suggests that the Nachash has particular expertise in exploiting human desires for knowledge, power, and significance. These aren't inherently evil desires, but the Hebrew reveals that they can be corrupted and redirected toward destructive ends through subtle manipulation and false promises. In Eden, the Nachash appealed to Eve's desire for wisdom and her aspiration to be like God. These were actually reflections of legitimate human longings, but the Hebrew shows how they were redirected toward rebellion and disobedience. The same pattern continues throughout history as the Nachash exploits our highest aspirations for the lowest purposes. The Hebrew language reveals that understanding the Nachash's true nature and methods isn't just academic knowledge. It's essential spiritual intelligence that determines whether we can recognize and resist ongoing deception. The ancient scribes preserved these insights because they understood that the war begun in Eden continues in every generation. But the Hebrew also contains something that the Nachash apparently failed to fully comprehend when it orchestrated the fall. Hidden within the very structure of the curse pronounced in Eden is a prophetic promise that speaks of the Nachash's ultimate defeat through the same human nature it sought to corrupt forever. The Hebrew reveals that what the Nachash intended as humanity's permanent spiritual death would actually become the context for an even greater demonstration of divine love and power. The corruption it introduced would be healed. The separation it caused would be bridged, and the very beings it sought to destroy would become the instruments of its own defeat. This Hebrew insight transforms our understanding of human history from a tragic tale of corruption and decline into an epic story of cosmic redemption. Every human struggle against deception, every choice for truth over lies, every act of love over selfishness becomes part of a larger victory over the ancient enemy who first whispered lies in Eden. The Hebrew secret we've been uncovering doesn't just explain the past. It provides crucial intelligence for the ongoing spiritual war that continues to rage around us. Understanding the Nachash's true nature and methods becomes essential for anyone who wants to walk in truth and resist the same deceptions that have corrupted human consciousness for millennia. But there's still more to this Hebrew revelation that will shake your understanding to its very core. The ancient language contains insights about the Nachash's current activities and ultimate destiny that will completely transform how you perceive the spiritual battle raging in our world today. The deepest secrets are yet to be revealed. The Hebrew reveals something that will fundamentally challenge everything you think you know about the nature of reality itself. When we examine the genealogies that follow the Eden narrative, the original language exposes a pattern so disturbing that it explains the escalating darkness we see throughout human history. You see, the Hebrew doesn't just record the descendants of Adam and Eve as a simple family tree. The language structure reveals two distinct lineages emerging from humanity's first children. One line carries the image of God more clearly, while the other bears the increasing influence of the Nachash's corruption. This isn't just about good and bad people. The Hebrew suggests something far more profound. The word used to describe Cain's offspring in Hebrew carries connotations that are absolutely chilling. The text doesn't just say they were violent or rebellious. The Hebrew language pattern suggests they were becoming something other than fully human. They were developing characteristics that aligned more closely with the Nachash's nature than with their original divine image. Think about what this means. The Nachash's deception in Eden wasn't just a one-time event. The Hebrew reveals it was the beginning of an ongoing transformation process. Each generation that chose to align with the serpent's influence became a little less human and a little more like their spiritual father. The corruption was progressive and cumulative. The Hebrew word for violence that appears in connection with these early descendants carries implications of spiritual as well as physical brutality. It suggests beings who had developed the Nachash's capacity for sophisticated cruelty, its ability to corrupt and destroy with calculated precision, rather than mere animal aggression. But here's where the Hebrew revelation becomes truly terrifying. The text suggests that as these corrupted lineages multiplied, they didn't just commit individual acts of evil. They began to organize and systematize their corruption, creating structures and institutions that would perpetuate and amplify the Nachash's influence across entire societies. The Hebrew describes the development of cities and technologies, but the language carries dark undertones. These weren't just human achievements. The text suggests they were expressions of the Nachash's agenda being worked out through human instrumentality. Knowledge and power being used not to serve God's purposes but to advance the ancient serpent's war against divine order. The ancient Hebrew scribes understood something that we've largely forgotten in our modern world. They recognized that certain technological and social developments throughout history haven't been neutral human progress. They've been manifestations of the Nachash's influence, ways of reshaping human society to align more closely with its principles of deception and rebellion. The Hebrew language reveals that the Nachash's ultimate goal isn't just individual corruption. It's the complete transformation of human civilization into a system that operates according to its values rather than God's. Every structure that promotes deception over truth, power over service, or self-worship over divine reverence advances this ancient agenda. But the Hebrew contains an even more shocking revelation about the Nachash's methods. The text suggests that this being has learned to work through human institutions in ways that make its influence nearly invisible. It doesn't need to appear directly anymore because it has successfully embedded its principles into the very foundations of fallen human society. Consider how the Nachash operated in Eden. It didn't force Eve to disobey. It simply presented information in a way that made rebellion seem reasonable and attractive. The Hebrew reveals that this same technique has been scaled up to influence entire cultures and civilizations. Ideas that align with the Nachash's agenda are presented as enlightenment, progress, and liberation. The Hebrew word for wisdom that the Nachash promised Eve has a dark counterpart throughout Scripture. There's divine wisdom that leads to life, and there's a counterfeit wisdom that leads to destruction. The ancient language reveals that the Nachash specializes in promoting this false wisdom, making destructive ideas seem sophisticated and enlightened. This explains why many of the most harmful ideologies in human history have been presented as advanced thinking or progressive enlightenment. The Hebrew shows that the Nachash understands human psychology well enough to make its most destructive suggestions feel like intellectual and moral evolution. The Hebrew text also reveals something crucial about the Nachash's relationship to human governments and power structures. The language suggests that this being has particular interest in influencing those who hold authority over others, because corrupting leaders multiplies its impact exponentially. Throughout biblical history, we see examples of rulers who seem to operate with supernatural levels of cunning and cruelty. The Hebrew indicates that many of these weren't just exceptionally evil humans. They were individuals who had become so aligned with the Nachash's nature that they served as conduits for its agenda of systematic deception and oppression. The ancient Hebrew contains warnings about the Nachash's ability to work through religious systems, as well as political ones. The language reveals that this being has particular expertise in corrupting spiritual authority, using it to lead people away from truth while maintaining the appearance of godliness. This Hebrew insight explains why some of history's greatest spiritual deceptions have come from within religious institutions themselves. The Nachash doesn't just attack faith from the outside. It infiltrates spiritual communities and uses their own sacred language and concepts to introduce corruption from within. The Hebrew word for prophecy that appears throughout Scripture has a counterfeit version associated with the Nachash's influence. True prophecy reveals God's heart and purposes. False prophecy, the Hebrew suggests, carries the Nachash's agenda while claiming divine authority. The ability to distinguish between them becomes a matter of spiritual life and death. But the Hebrew reveals something even more disturbing about the Nachash's current activities. The language patterns in apocalyptic texts suggest that this being's influence is building toward a climactic expression of its rebellion against divine authority. Everything it has been working toward throughout human history is converging toward a final confrontation. The Hebrew describes a time when the Nachash's influence will become more overt and systematic than ever before. The subtle deceptions that have characterized its work throughout history will give way to more direct challenges to divine authority. The hidden war will become visible warfare. The ancient language suggests that the Nachash will eventually consolidate its influence through human agents who will create global systems of control and deception. These won't just be political or economic structures. The Hebrew indicates they will be comprehensive systems designed to corrupt every aspect of human existence. Think about the implications. If the Nachash has been working throughout history to embed its principles into human civilization, then its ultimate goal must be the creation of a global society that operates entirely according to its values. A world where deception is normalized, where rebellion against divine authority is celebrated, and where the very concept of absolute truth is eliminated. The Hebrew reveals that this ancient enemy understands something crucial about human nature that most people miss. We were created for worship, and we will worship something whether we realize it or not. The Nachash's strategy is to redirect human worship away from the Creator toward created things, ultimately toward itself as the source of knowledge and power. This explains the consistent pattern we see throughout history of human societies creating idols and false gods. The Hebrew suggests these aren't just primitive religious practices. They're expressions of the Nachash's ongoing campaign to usurp divine worship and establish itself as the object of human devotion. The Hebrew language also reveals something about the Nachash's relationship to death itself. In Eden, it promised that disobedience wouldn't result in death, but the Hebrew shows that death became its primary weapon for terrorizing and controlling humanity. It introduced the fear of death as a tool for manipulation and coercion. But here's where the Hebrew contains a profound irony. The text suggests that the Nachash's own relationship to death is more complex than it appears. While it uses death as a weapon against humanity, the Hebrew indicates that this being itself exists in a state that could only be described as spiritual death, separation from the source of all life. The ancient Hebrew reveals that the Nachash's rebellion didn't just result in punishment. It resulted in a fundamental alteration of its nature that cut it off from the divine life that sustains all existence. Its corruption of humanity is, in a sense, an attempt to drag others into the same state of spiritual death that it experiences. This Hebrew insight transforms our understanding of why the Nachash is so determined to corrupt and destroy human life. It's not just motivated by hatred of God or jealousy of humanity. The text suggests it's driven by the agony of its own spiritual condition, seeking to alleviate its isolation by corrupting others into the same state of separation from divine life. The Hebrew word for torment that appears in connection with final judgment carries implications of self-inflicted suffering. The Nachash's ultimate punishment won't just be imposed from outside. The language suggests it will be the natural consequence of choices that have progressively separated it from everything good and life-giving. But the Hebrew also reveals something that provides hope in the midst of these dark revelations. The same texts that describe the Nachash's ongoing influence also contain prophecies about its ultimate defeat. The ancient language suggests that every strategy it has employed throughout history will eventually be turned against it. The Hebrew indicates that the Nachash's very success in corrupting human nature will become the context for an even greater demonstration of divine power and love. The depths of human depravity will highlight the heights of divine mercy. The extent of the corruption will magnify the magnitude of the redemption. The ancient scribes who preserved these Hebrew texts understood something profound about the nature of the cosmic conflict they were documenting. They recognized that the Nachash's apparent victories throughout history are actually setting the stage for a defeat so complete and final that it will vindicate divine justice for all eternity. The Hebrew reveals that the Nachash has been permitted to advance its agenda not because it has successfully thwarted divine purposes, but because its rebellion is serving those purposes in ways it cannot comprehend. Every lie will ultimately serve truth. Every act of corruption will ultimately highlight purity. Every expression of hatred will ultimately magnify love. This doesn't minimize the reality of the suffering and destruction that the Nachash has caused throughout history. The Hebrew texts don't romanticize evil or suggest that the ends justify the means. But they do reveal that divine sovereignty is so complete that even rebellion against it ultimately serves divine purposes. The Hebrew language contains prophecies that speak of a time when the Nachash's influence will be completely eliminated from human experience. The corruption it introduced in Eden will be fully healed. The separation it caused will be permanently bridged. The fear of death it weaponized will be forever conquered. But these prophecies also reveal that the Nachash's defeat won't come through human effort or wisdom. The Hebrew indicates that the same divine power that created the universe will be required to undo the damage that this ancient enemy has caused. Only God can fully repair what the Nachash has corrupted. The ancient Hebrew texts suggest that understanding the true nature and methods of the Nachash isn't meant to create fear or despair. It's meant to provide the spiritual intelligence necessary to recognize and resist ongoing deception. Knowledge of the enemy's strategies is essential for anyone who wants to walk in truth and freedom. The Hebrew reveals that the Nachash's power, though real and dangerous, is ultimately limited and temporary. It can influence and manipulate, but it cannot create or truly control. It can corrupt what God has made, but it cannot make anything genuinely new or lasting. Its apparent victories are actually the seeds of its own ultimate defeat. But there's still one final Hebrew secret that we haven't yet uncovered. Hidden within the prophecies about the Nachash's ultimate defeat is a revelation so extraordinary that it will completely transform your understanding of your own identity and destiny. The deepest mystery is about to be unveiled, and it concerns not just what the Nachash is, but what you were created to become in spite of its influence. The ancient Hebrew contains truths about human potential and divine purpose that the Nachash has spent millennia trying to obscure. What it feared most about humanity in Eden is exactly what it continues to fear today. And that fear is the key to understanding both its desperate strategies and its inevitable defeat. The final Hebrew revelation about human identity will shatter every limitation the Nachash has tried to impose upon us. You see, buried within the ancient text is a truth so profound that it explains why this being was so desperate to corrupt humanity in the first place. The Hebrew doesn't just describe what we lost in Eden. It reveals what we were created to become. The word used for human beings in the original Hebrew carries implications that most translations completely miss. We weren't just made in God's image as some kind of static resemblance. The Hebrew language structure suggests we were created as dynamic beings with the capacity for ongoing transformation into something that would eventually surpass even the highest orders of created beings. Think about what this means. The Nachash wasn't just jealous of humanity's relationship with God. The Hebrew reveals it was terrified of what we might become if that relationship continued to develop. We were created with potential that even the most exalted spiritual beings could never achieve. We were designed to grow into something unprecedented in all of creation. The Hebrew word for dominion that God gave to humanity carries connotations of expanding authority and creative power. We weren't just meant to tend a garden. The ancient language suggests we were being prepared for responsibilities that would eventually extend throughout the entire created order. The Nachash saw this potential and moved to destroy it before it could be realized. But here's where the Hebrew secret becomes truly explosive. The text suggests that the Nachash's deception actually failed to accomplish its ultimate objective. While it successfully corrupted human nature and separated us from God temporarily, it couldn't destroy the fundamental capacity that made it so afraid of us in the first place. The Hebrew reveals that buried within every human being, even the most corrupted, remains what could only be described as a divine seed. It's the core essence of what we were created to be, and no amount of spiritual contamination can completely eliminate it. The Nachash's influence can suppress it, distort it, redirect it, but it cannot destroy it. This explains something that has puzzled observers of human nature throughout history. Why do even the most hardened individuals sometimes show flashes of nobility and goodness? Why do people raised in the worst circumstances sometimes rise above their conditioning? The Hebrew suggests it's because the original divine nature is still there, waiting to be awakened. The ancient Hebrew texts contain prophecies about a time when this dormant potential will be fully activated in those who choose to align themselves with divine purposes. The corruption introduced by the Nachash will be completely healed, and humanity will finally become what we were originally designed to be. But the Hebrew reveals something even more remarkable. The process of overcoming the Nachash's corruption won't just restore us to our original state. The ancient language suggests that the struggle itself will develop capacities and qualities that wouldn't have existed without the conflict. We'll become something greater than we would have been if the fall had never happened. This Hebrew insight transforms the entire narrative from a tragedy with a happy ending into an epic story of transformation through conflict. The Nachash's rebellion becomes the unwitting catalyst for human development into something more glorious than anything that existed before. Its greatest victory becomes the foundation for its ultimate defeat. The Hebrew word for redemption that appears throughout Scripture carries connotations of buying back something at a price greater than its original value. We're not just being restored to Eden. The ancient language suggests we're being prepared for a destiny that surpasses even what Adam and Eve experienced before the fall. Think about the implications. If humanity's ultimate destiny exceeds our original state, then the Nachash's deception has actually served divine purposes in ways it never intended. Every challenge it has created has become an opportunity for growth. Every corruption it has introduced has highlighted the need for divine intervention that results in greater glory. The Hebrew reveals that this is why the Nachash's influence becomes more desperate and overt as history progresses. It's beginning to understand that its rebellion hasn't just failed to destroy human potential. It's actually accelerated the process by which that potential will be realized. Its strategies are backfiring on a cosmic scale. The ancient texts suggest that there will come a time when the full extent of human potential is finally revealed. When that happens, the Hebrew indicates that even the Nachash itself will be forced to acknowledge the wisdom and power of the divine plan it sought to thwart. Its rebellion will be seen for what it truly was, the desperate flailing of a created being against its creator. But the Hebrew contains one final secret about the nature of this cosmic conflict. The ancient language suggests that the war between the Nachash and humanity isn't just about us. It's about vindicating divine character before all created beings. Every victory over deception becomes a testimony to truth. Every act of redemption becomes a demonstration of love. The Hebrew reveals that the Nachash's rebellion raised questions about God's nature and methods that could only be answered through the unfolding of history. Is divine love truly unconditional? Is divine justice truly perfect? Is divine power truly unlimited? The conflict with the Nachash provides the context for answering these questions definitively. When human beings choose truth over deception despite the Nachash's influence, we become witnesses to divine character. When we choose love over hatred despite our corrupted nature, we demonstrate the reality of divine transformation. When we choose faith over fear despite the Nachash's intimidation, we prove the power of divine grace. The Hebrew language reveals that every person who overcomes the Nachash's influence becomes part of a cosmic testimony that will resonate throughout eternity. Our individual victories contribute to a larger story that vindicates divine character before all created beings. We're not just being saved from corruption, we're becoming evidence of divine goodness. The ancient Hebrew texts suggest that when this cosmic conflict finally reaches its conclusion, the questions raised by the Nachash's rebellion will be answered so completely that no created being will ever doubt divine character again. The rebellion that began in Eden will result in a universe more stable and secure than anything that existed before. But until that final resolution, the Hebrew reveals that the battle continues in every human heart. Each of us carries within ourselves the capacity to align either with the Nachash's agenda of deception and rebellion, or with divine purposes of truth and redemption. The choice we make determines not just our individual destiny, but contributes to the outcome of the cosmic conflict itself. The Hebrew word for overcome that appears in connection with final victory carries connotations of conquest through endurance rather than through force. The Nachash will ultimately be defeated not by superior power meeting it on its own terms, but by a different kind of strength altogether. Truth will triumph over deception through persistent faithfulness rather than through dramatic confrontation. This Hebrew insight explains why the divine response to the Nachash's rebellion has seemed so restrained throughout history. The victory being won is not just tactical but moral. It's not enough to simply overpower the Nachash. Its accusations and implications must be answered so thoroughly that the victory is seen as just and wise by all observers. The ancient language suggests that when the final resolution comes, even the Nachash itself will be forced to acknowledge the justice of its defeat. Every strategy it has employed will be shown to have served divine purposes. Every lie it has told will highlight the beauty of truth. Every act of corruption will magnify the glory of purity. The Hebrew reveals that this is the ultimate irony of the Nachash's rebellion. In its desperate attempt to prove that divine character is flawed and divine purposes are unjust, it has actually created the perfect context for demonstrating the opposite. Its rebellion becomes the dark background against which divine light shines most brilliantly. But the Hebrew also contains a sobering warning. While the Nachash's ultimate defeat is certain, its current influence remains real and dangerous. The ancient texts make clear that until the final resolution, this being continues to work actively to corrupt and destroy human life. Understanding its methods remains essential for spiritual survival. The Hebrew language reveals specific patterns and characteristics that mark the Nachash's influence in our current world. Learning to recognize these markers becomes crucial for anyone who wants to align themselves with divine purposes rather than ancient rebellion. The war that began in Eden continues to rage, and neutrality is not an option. The Hebrew word for discernment that appears throughout Scripture carries connotations of separating truth from error through divine insight rather than human wisdom. This kind of spiritual intelligence becomes essential for navigating a world where the Nachash's deceptions have become increasingly sophisticated and subtle. The ancient text suggests that as history approaches its climax, the Nachash's influence will become both more overt and more deceptive. The same being that once appeared as a serpent will manifest through systems and ideologies that seem beneficial on the surface but serve its ancient agenda of rebellion and corruption. The Hebrew reveals that recognizing these end-time deceptions will require more than intellectual analysis. It will demand the kind of spiritual discernment that comes only through intimate connection with divine truth. Those who rely solely on human wisdom will be vulnerable to the Nachash's most sophisticated lies. But the Hebrew also contains promises of divine protection and guidance for those who choose to align themselves with truth. The same power that will ultimately defeat the Nachash is available now to help individual humans resist its influence and walk in freedom. The victory that is certain in the future can be experienced in measure today. The ancient Hebrew texts reveal that the cosmic conflict between truth and deception, between divine love and ancient rebellion, will ultimately result in a creation more glorious than anything that has existed before. The Nachash's rebellion will be seen as the catalyst for developments that bring greater glory to divine character than would have been possible without the conflict. This Hebrew revelation transforms our understanding of suffering, struggle, and spiritual warfare from meaningless tragedy into meaningful participation in cosmic victory. Every choice for truth over deception, every act of love over hatred, every moment of faith over fear contributes to the ultimate triumph of divine purposes over ancient rebellion. The Hebrew language suggests that when the final chapter of this cosmic story is written, even the Nachash's rebellion will be seen as serving divine purposes in ways that bring greater glory than if the rebellion had never occurred. The greatest evil will become the context for the greatest good. The deepest darkness will highlight the brightest light. But that final victory, though certain, remains future. The Hebrew reveals that until it comes, the battle continues, and each of us must choose which side we will serve. The Nachash's ancient deception still whispers in human hearts, but the divine voice still calls us to truth, freedom, and our ultimate destiny as beings created in the image of God. The Hebrew secret we've uncovered doesn't just explain the past or predict the future. It reveals the present reality of a cosmic conflict in which every human being is called to participate. Understanding the true nature of the Nachash and its ongoing influence becomes essential intelligence for anyone who wants to walk in truth and contribute to the ultimate victory of divine love over ancient rebellion. The Hebrew secrets we've uncovered today reveal a truth that changes everything. The Nachash wasn't just a talking snake. It was a being of supernatural intelligence and power, a fallen entity that understood exactly what it was doing when it orchestrated humanity's corruption in Eden. Every word it spoke, every strategy it employed, every consequence it engineered was calculated with terrifying precision. But here's what the ancient enemy never anticipated. Its very success in corrupting human nature has become the foundation for an even greater demonstration of divine love and power. The darkness it introduced highlights the light. The corruption it caused magnifies the beauty of redemption. The separation it engineered makes restoration all the more glorious. The Hebrew reveals that this cosmic conflict isn't just ancient history. It continues today in every human heart, in every choice between truth and deception, in every decision to align with divine purposes or ancient rebellion. Understanding the Nachash's methods isn't academic knowledge. It's essential spiritual intelligence for recognizing and resisting the same deceptions that have corrupted human consciousness for millennia. Yet the Hebrew also contains this profound promise. The same divine nature that the Nachash sought to destroy still burns within every human soul. No amount of corruption can completely extinguish what we were created to become. The victory that is certain in the future can be experienced in measure today by those who choose truth over lies, love over hatred, faith over fear. The serpent's ancient whisper still echoes, but it no longer has the final word. The Hebrew secret reveals that what began as humanity's greatest defeat is destined to become the context for our greatest triumph. And that victory begins the moment you choose to see through the deception and embrace the truth that has been hidden in plain sight all along.